Hey everybody, how's it going? A lot of you seem to be under the false impression that I would actually pay $10 for orange juice. This is free. This costs nothing, and that actually causes it to taste better. If you check out YouTube.com/Cinevision, that's YouTube.com/Cinevision with a C, you will see that how she gets all of this stuff for close to free. There are all these stores in New York that throw away stuff. I don't mean throw away like it's half open. I mean it's still in retail packaging. It still has the tamper-proof seals on it and everything. They just throw it away because it's going to expire in 1 week instead of 3 weeks. You know, that chair, free. All hundreds of dollars worth of flowers, free. Christmas tree, free. She loves frying 90% off the tree. She loves finding free shit, and you can see how she does it at youtube.com/Cinevision. That'll be $500. The Kardashians charge more for a shout out. So that being said, what I wanted to discuss today were the new rollout of a bunch of COVID shutdowns and just some thoughts. So New York City is discussing the prospects of a new COVID shutdown. If we do not change our trajectory, we'll be headed to shutdown, Cuomo said. Something tells me that his governorship is very soon to be shut down if this scandal continues moving forward, unless something were to, let's say, question its credibility, like statements that they made 2 years ago. Well, yeah, I really am curious to watch that entire thing unfold. Regardless of what winds up happening in New York City, I kind of wonder, just because Germany has announced a shutdown, Netherlands has announced a shutdown, we're probably going to have one in the next few days. And one of the questions that's really been rolling in my mind is, I realize that our handling of the pandemic was fairly bad. But I'm also kind of curious if really anybody in the world has a handle on this at this point. Like, I know that New Zealand and Australia have a very low number of cases. So if you look at Australia, they really managed to kill it, but they also had a 110-day lockdown, which is kind of a not just kill COVID, kind of kill everything thing. I don't know how I would deal with a 110-day lockdown, but they had a 110-day lockdown and they have controlled their cases. However, when you look, New York. Honestly, the United States had a lot of issues with their COVID response. The two big ones for me were testing. They had months to prepare testing, and they didn't. I remember in late March and early April, they were telling you if you wanted to get a COVID test, you needed to know someone else that tested positive to get it. But you don't know anybody who tested positive because they need to know somebody else who tested positive to get it. And once I realized that the testing regimen was based on this scam, it made me want to unsubscribe from my tax subscription to government entirely for the year and just be done with it, because it was clearly obvious at that point that even given several months with trillions of dollars of tax revenue, that they had no ability to plan at all, and that you couldn't even get basic testing. And also the fact that the lockdown would start here and this state or this city would have this lockdown, but then you'd have to go to this federal agency to apply for relief 6 to 12 weeks after, and you may not even get it, but you still have to pay the people in this meeting. Like, our response was a clusterfuck. Don't get it twisted. But when I look at what's been going on across the world, solely from a containing the virus point of view, I'm not seeing where most other countries are getting it. So you look at Germany. They're still doing better than us. They have about 80 million people, and they're at 14,000 to 20,000 cases a day. New York has about 18 or 19 million people, and we're at like 11,000 a day. So we're doing worse than Germany. But you look at Germany, again, they're doing better than us, but this is still pretty much the same kind of pattern. You had the first lockdown, then not many new cases, second wave, and boom. You look at France, they had their first one, and then that's a lot of cases. That's like a spike of 86,000 for a day. Yeah, the Netherlands, they had their first spike, and then it goes up again. Like Russia, India, all of these countries appear to be having issues with the spread. And you have countries with private healthcare, and you have countries with free public healthcare. You have countries that are more individualistic, less individualistic. There's so many differences throughout all these countries, yet they're all seemingly having a lot of the same problem. So even though our response sucked in many ways when it comes to dealing with it economically and being able to get just basics of dealing with a fucking test, other countries don't appear to just have magically solved it, besides Australia and New Zealand. And I kind of wonder how much of Australia and New Zealand solving it, like how much of that is specifically the details of how they did their lockdowns differently versus them just being less traveled, isolated continents in the world. Like with Germany, they had something similar to the United States. So they had a lockdown that was that lasted for a short period of time. Then afterwards, when there were spikes, they had all the different municipalities and areas decide for themselves how much of a lockdown that they wanted to have. Similar to the US. So you'd have this area which would have a harsher one, this area where you could kind of probably do most normal things that you would usually do. It wasn't a one country deciding for everybody, here's how we're going to handle it. And that's been criticized for the spike in cases. But then you also have, again, you have France, you have the Netherlands, like Russia, India, all these countries appear to be getting creamed in a similar fashion. And I'm kind of curious what's going to wind up happening with this. Like in New York, I was reading this article just when restaurants thought 2020 couldn't get any worse. I do think that pandemic fatigue is going to set in. As I ride around the city, I see more people disobeying both the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. Like whether it's, the wearing the mask over here or over here. People wearing the mask over here. This is like everywhere. Some people are not going out at all. Some are hanging out with their friends. Some are hanging out with people they barely even know in enclosed quarters. And I think a big part of the pandemic fatigue is going to wind up from conflicting information. So this one's talking about the restaurants. It says the blanket shutdown is a bit of a betrayal, said Mr. Winterman, who had supported Mr. Cuomo's strategy of targeting small geographic areas based on their case rates and hospitalization numbers. Mr. Cuomo undermined his case for a citywide shutdown when he acknowledged that restaurants and bars accounted for less than 2% of new COVID cases, while saying that 74% of new COVID cases are coming from household gatherings. So most of the COVID cases are coming from living rooms and household gatherings. So the thing to do is to lock people in their homes and shut down the restaurants. Again, to be clear, I'm not someone who's going to indoor dining anytime soon. I'm not radically destroying my life and my way of making income because of COVID. But at the same time, I'm not running towards COVID to give it a nice kiss and a hug at the same time. Indoor dining in New York City, there's some good restaurants. There's a ton of shit restaurants where you're going to pay $20 to $50, not be full, have to listen to crappy music, have a crappy way. It's not an experience for me that I'm very excited about, particularly if there's any sort of risk of viral transmission. It's just, I don't care. I'm not somebody that's going to be going to indoor dining. At the same time, if most of the cases are coming from the home, and then you're shutting down the restaurants so that they can't be open, and then telling people to stay at home, a lot of people are just going to look at that and go, what the fuck? I remember just my experience with my business, there was only one confirmed case of COVID. There was one other person that may have had it, but again, you couldn't get a test because of that bullshit scam going on back in March that really showed how ineffective and pathetic our government actually is. He wanted to stay home. He was afraid of spreading COVID to family or getting COVID and giving it to his family, so he got a nice paid stay-at-home COVID vacation. He didn't give his family COVID. His family got COVID and gave it to him. His parents got COVID and gave it to him. Now, why did this happen? Well, usually, he'd leave, do his errands or whatever in the morning, go out, and then come home after he was done going out, after he was done with work. Limited interaction with family. Versus I'm awake for 17 or 18 hours a day, and those 17 hours I'm going to be with my family. There's a higher likelihood of you getting COVID. So the one confirmed case of COVID that I have at work is the one person that stayed home the longest to avoid it, which is just kind of interesting. And I think that this kind of stuff is going to wind up, I think just stuff like this is going to wind up causing even more pandemic fatigue. Since I do read the New York Times, I read my Bloomberg, and I read the stories about how South Dakota is a death cult almost every single day. So I actually decided to dig in just a little bit out of curiosity and see what the numbers were like here. So one of the things I did was you can figure out how I calculate these numbers. You literally just Google a state and COVID, and it will pop up the COVID cases and deaths for that particular area. So assuming the data is correct, this is South Dakota's population, which is 884,659 people, and that's the number of deaths. And when you take that, divide it by this, multiply it by 100, you get the percentage of deaths of the population that died of COVID in the state. So in South Dakota, you got 0.14% of their population died of COVID. The interesting thing, when you go to New York State, you got 0.18% of the population that died of COVID. This is the whole state. So granted, this is going to include New York City, which is highly densely populated, but it also includes all the urban areas like out where Jessa lives, where you have a giant yard and a giant backyard, an area so big that you have foxes roaming through it. New York actually has a higher percentage of the population dying of COVID than South Dakota. Now, what South Dakota failed at, if you take a look at cases, is the number of people that got it. So in New York State, throughout the entire state, 1.87% of the state contracted COVID. If you take a look at the number of confirmed cases and the number of people in the state and multiply by 100, you get the percentage. Whereas South Dakota, 10.3% of them got COVID. So by percentage, about 5 or 10 times as many people in South Dakota, by percentage of population, got COVID than in New York. However, less of them died. Now, the statistic that I'm personally interested in, again, I'd rather get COVID and not die than have lesser people get COVID, but more of those people who get COVID wind up being dead. And that seems to me to be a big failure in New York's part. And a big part of that has to do with taking the elderly and putting them back into the nursing home. I don't understand why the fuck we did that. We had the Javits Center set up to be a hospital here for COVID patients. I think the USS Comfort ship came here. We had so many opportunities to create new spaces so that even if hospitals were overwhelmed, elderly people with COVID were not put back in contact with other elderly people with COVID. And we didn't do that. We could have kept the Javits Center set up as just a place to isolate elderly people with COVID away from other elderly people that have lots of comorbidities that are not in the best of condition. And when you look at the stats, this is, I think it was coronavirus deaths by underlying condition on GitHub from NYC Health. This here has the just number. You can see this is something that is affecting the elderly disproportionately. So when you have death count total, 25 to 34, then you have 65 to 74 and 75 plus. This is something that's really hitting the elderly. And I think that in New York, I think we really did kind of fail at protecting the elderly, and that sucks. What do you think is going to happen when another lockdown hits Germany, Netherlands, and New York? Because it's coming. It's going to come in the next few days. And I really do think that people are going to start getting pandemic fatigue. I think that people are going to look at stuff like 2 weeks to slow the spread, and most of our cases appear to be coming from people staying at home. So what you need to do is have a lockdown where more people are going to stay at home and go what are you doing? What are you doing? I really do wonder how much of New Zealand and Australia's success had to do with the fact that those areas just have less overall travel than, let's say, LaGuardia or JFK or Newark Airport or San Francisco or San Jose. Because you saw the areas that got hit the worst in the United States were the areas that are considered either the tech hubs or the international financial and business hubs of the world, where you have people traveling nonstop all the time, very, very densely populated, and then it kind of spread out eventually to everybody else. The more I read on this, two things really tend to stick in my head. A, the U.S.'s COVID response in many ways sucked. And B, a lot of the rest of the world, while they may have handled it better economically so that their people felt like they were being taken care of rather than just being left everybody for themselves, Lord of the Flies shit, they did that part better. It doesn't seem like most other areas of the world, nobody seems to have a magic bullet of this is how you prevent COVID from spreading. Maybe it is new. Maybe New Zealand and Australia's model is something that genuinely would have worked if it was implemented that specific way around the world. Because I know in Germany, they had this model where certain areas of Germany would lock down, but other areas wouldn't lock down as hard. Like every single specific area was able to choose how they would deal with COVID in their particular area, who could stay open and not stay open, what gatherings can be allowed and not be allowed, rather than it just being a national mandate. And that was partially criticized for the response. But again, you also have all these other countries that are having these crazy rises in COVID. I'm kind of curious to see how this winds up panning out. And I'm also kind of curious how Cuomo is going to multitask dealing with all the people who are starting to get tired of the lockdowns and everything, and just juggling that with some of the new stuff that's coming across his desk now. Stuff like that just doesn't go away nowadays. It really doesn't. And I can't think of it happening to a more benevolent dictator than Cuomo. I hope to God he doesn't become attorney general. I really don't. I'm not even religious, but I still pray every night just in case. Any chance whatsoever that he doesn't become attorney general, because that would be absolutely horrible. Because then you can't leave. You see? Because here's the thing. Leaving New York is very difficult, but I would have to find 10 or 15 new employees and train them. And you see how hard it is to find just 7 to 8 competent board repair people in a fucking city of 8.4 million. Can you imagine what it would be like going to a town of 30,000 and trying to find another 8? It took me 7 years to find the people I have now, but at least I could leave. Cuomo becomes attorney general of the United States, then you're genuinely stuck with him. It doesn't matter what state you go to. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below of all this COVID stuff. How do you think the new lockdowns are going to work? Do you think that there is a country that just easily has a clear-cut and obvious way of handling COVID so that it doesn't spread? What do you think is going to happen as this goes forward? Do you think another lockdown is going to be effective? And do you think people are going to listen to it? Just kind of curious to hear your thoughts. That's it for today. And as always, I hope to learn something from all of you, actually. I'll be reading your comments. That's it. And enjoy your free orange juice. It genuinely tastes better when it's free. Can't believe people in my comment section thought I paid $10 for orange juice. Might as well buy a MacBook while I'm at it.